Hi, everyone, and welcome to the Prepared for Environmental Change webinar series hosted by the Indiana University Environmental Resilience Institute. We would like to acknowledge and to honor the Mi'kmaq, Lenape, Boded-Wadmik, and Sawanwa people as past, present, and future caretakers of the lands on which Indiana University Bloomington is located. These ancestral indigenous homelands and resources are the current home of the Environmental Resilience Institute. We encourage everyone to engage with contemporary communities, to learn the histories of this land, to learn who has and who does not have access to its resources, and to examine your own place, abilities, and obligations within the process of reparative work. Our webinar today will focus on smart growth policy strategies for climate resilience and equitable community development. All webinar attendees are muted. Please enter your questions in the chat function, which you can access by hovering your mouse over the Zoom window. In the last few minutes of the webinar, we will share a feedback survey through a Zoom poll. And we are also recording today's webinar, and I will share that link to that recording along with follow-up resources with all registrants early next week so that you can share what you've learned with your colleagues. And now I'm very pleased to introduce today's moderator, Matt Flaherty, which is our implementation manager at ERI.
Welcome, everyone. So glad you could join us today for this important topic. So the way we develop in our communities has a significant impact on both greenhouse gas emissions, as well as our ability to withstand extreme weather and natural disasters that are worsened by climate change. A smart growth approach to development is key to mitigating and adapting to climate change, as it encourages a mix of building types and uses, diverse housing and transportation options, enables connected and healthy neighborhoods, and also is defined by robust and equitable community engagement. So we're excited to have Katharine Burgess, the Vice President of Land Use and Development at Smart Growth America, as well as Kim Irwin, the Executive Director of Health by Design, to engage with us on these important issues today. First, a note that this webinar series is coordinated by IU's Environmental Resilience Institute. And in addition to the webinar series, we have a lot of resources and tools available to local governments and residents to help understand and prepare for the impacts of climate change and to act on mitigating their causes. The resource I wanted to highlight today is the Hoosier Resilience Index, or HRI as we call it, which you can find at hri.eri.iu.edu. So the HRI tool helps local governments and residents learn about current and projected climate impacts in their city or county, such as extreme heat, extreme precipitation, and flooding, as well as the social dimensions of vulnerability to these hazards. The HRI Readiness Assessment is part of the tool, and it provides an in-depth self-assessment tool for local governments to evaluate their community's preparedness for these impacts and then prioritize actions to increase resilience. Among those strategies, smart growth principles, the topic of today's webinar, are at the core of equitable adaptation and resilience, especially in the built environment, from growing sustainable transportation options to planning and land use policies that support vibrant and healthy neighborhoods. As I'm sure we'll hear from our presenters today, racial equity and restorative justice are at the heart of smart growth, especially given the history and context of zoning and transportation decisions from the past that harm communities of color, for instance, through redlining, highway development that destroyed neighborhoods and divided communities, and more. At ERI, we are committed to fighting for environmental justice and against systemic racism in all our work, so we're excited to explore how smart growth can help local governments advance equity and build resilience in their communities. We also hope you'll be able to join us for next month's webinar, which is titled Connecting Habitats and People for Climate Resilient Landscapes. Just a quick note that this is an updated title as we've narrowed the focus for that presentation a bit. So our presenters will be focusing on sustainable land management practices, including how local governments, community organizations, and landowners can partner to enhance habitat connectivity and species migration, promote biodiversity, and increase landscape level adaptation. The image in the slide here on the right is from the newly designated Sentinel landscape in southern Indiana, which is anchored by 4 Department of Defense installations and ranges, but is also home to state parks, state and national forests, fish and wildlife areas, nature preserves, and more. And it can help provide a leading example of how to promote landscape resiliency in a multi-jurisdictional region. So we're excited for that webinar, where we'll host Dr. Vicky Moretsky, who is a professor at the IU O'Neill School of Public and Environmental Affairs and an expert on climate change impacts on natural resources. as well as Christian Freitag, the director of the Conservation Law Center at IU and a key partner on the Southern Indiana Sentinel landscape. Today, I also wanted to thank our co-hosts and sponsors of the webinar series, Accelerate Indiana Municipalities, the Association of Indiana Counties. A special thanks to Help by Design today, since we have Executive Director Kim Irwin joining us, and also the Indiana Public Health Association for continuing to support us. Thank you to everyone who is able to join and attend the webinar today. As a reminder, all our webinars are recorded and captioned and available on the ERI website. And we'll send a link to the recording and additional resources to all registrants for today's webinar. So we encourage you to share this with friends and colleagues who you think would find it interesting or instructive, even if they're unable to join us today. Finally, I'd like to introduce our speakers and then turn it over to them. So first we'll have Katharine Burgess from Smart Growth America, where she's the Vice President of Land Use and Development and oversees SGA's land use programs, including LOCUS, the Form-Based Codes Institute, and the National Brownfields Coalition. Prior to joining Smart Growth America, Katharine led the Urban Resilience Program at the Urban Land Institute. There, she built up the organization's program of work addressing how buildings, cities, and communities can be more prepared for the impacts of climate change, considering topics ranging from climate risk to built environment adaptation strategies addressing sea level rise, extreme heat, wildfires, and other climate hazards. Next, we'll hear from Kim Irwin, who has served as the Executive Director of Help by Design since 2008. She guides the strategic direction, partnership development, and programmatic, operational, and financial management of the organization. She holds a Master's of Public Health from the Indiana University School of Medicine, Department of Public Health, and an undergraduate degree from Northwestern University. She's a member of the Governor's Public Health Commission, and she volunteers with the League of Women Voters in Indianapolis. And so without further ado, I'll go ahead and turn it over to our first presenter today, Katharine.
Great, thank you so much for hosting today, Matt, and thanks to ERI and the whole team for putting this series together. I'm looking forward to talking about land use and climate adaptation and smart growth. And, we're a relatively small group today, so I'd encourage folks to use the raise hand function if you'd like to ask a question during the presentation, or even if you'd like to jump in and, relate some of the national themes to your own work. So I'm going to go ahead and screen share. 1 second, please. Is that coming through for everyone?
Looks good, yes.
Great. Well, I'm really excited to kick off today by looking big picture at some of the national trends related to smart growth and climate adaptation and strategies to use land use to advance preparedness for climate events. I'm going to be looking at some of the national policy precedents and a few case studies from around the country, and then look forward to hearing from Kim, sharing more of the regional perspective. And we're both excited to have questions from you all and initiate a dialogue today. So before I jump in, I'll share a little background on Smart Growth America. We are a national nonprofit focused on sustainable, equitable development. And our North Star is a country where no matter where you live or who you are, you can enjoy living in a place that is healthy, prosperous, and resilient. And a key part of that healthy, prosperous, and resilience is preparedness and safety from climate events like flooding, extreme heat, drought. There is so much development which is in harm's way, and there are strategies for land use policy and local elected decision makers to help communities be more prepared, both for the hazards that we are experiencing right now and the likely increased frequency and intensity in the future. So within SGA, we convene a number of different coalitions of practitioners, all of whom have their own role in making smart growth happen. This includes Transportation for America, which is a national coalition advocating for transportation investments, LOCUS, our coalition of triple bottom line real estate developers, and the Form-Based Codes Institute, which looks at zoning, innovation, and reform. So feel free to reach out if you have any questions or if you'd like to get involved during this event or afterwards. And we advance our efforts to bring the U.S. and communities across the country closer to this North Star through three kind of key strategies: technical assistance, working directly with communities on policy and local advocacy strategies; advocacy, largely federal advocacy, looking at how national policies can advance smart growth and investment in transit; then thought leadership, which includes everything from research to events like our annual Equity Summit. So before I jump into my area of expertise, I'd like to look at the big picture of how Smart Growth America has looked at climate action over the long term. We're a leader in advancing strategies for mitigation with a particular focus on how to reduce reliance on cars. So looking both at infrastructure investments and land use strategies, which will bring different uses together, mixed uses, different types of housing and different levels of affordability of housing to enable drivers to take fewer, shorter trips, which both obviously has environmental benefits and also has, a real host of community development, social, and health benefits. We did a report last year called Driving Down Emissions, looking at the role of cars in getting us where we are right now in the climate crisis. And I think it's important to keep in mind, while we're all talking about emissions and trying to reduce driving and change behavior, there are so many other larger and hidden consequences of our reliance on the car in the US. Thinking about supply chain issues, manufacturing, urban heat island, and the loss of natural land and natural ecosystems due to sprawl. The way that our country has chosen to invest in divisive highway infrastructure and infrastructure which prioritizes speed over safety has also had horrific public health impacts. And these are there's a host of inequities here with historically marginalized communities and Black and Brown communities which have been marginalized by land use, lending, and development policies the most impacted. And so this is trying to turn the tides here is a key focus for us. And every year we put out a report called Dangerous by Design. It will likely be out next month, which looks at traffic fatalities nationally and, unfortunately ranks the states by a number of fatalities, looking at, where a change in policy approach and change in investment approach is most needed. And this is the Dangerous by Design data from last year. And again, we'll have a new report out this year. And, again, this lack of safety and the divisive infrastructure is very much an equity issue where communities of color and low income communities are, by far the most impacted. So looking both at investment in infrastructure and transportation and land use, a real focus for us has been looking at smart growth strategies for climate adaptation. So if you consider the top line here is kind of the traditional definition of smart growth, an approach to development that encourages a mix of building types and uses and walkability. Let's also add on to this that this development approach needs to take into account the current and future impacts of climate change, whether that's extreme heat, sea level rise, wildfires, the needs and the hazards which are faced by different communities. There's a wide range, but in all cases, land use it presents an opportunity to both protect existing communities and to shift future development patterns. So a few of the methods which we have been looking at policy best practices, which municipalities have started to embed these approaches in their comp planning, in their zoning, are here. So a key one, especially for flood vulnerable communities, would be delivering higher density development in locations which are least susceptible to climate impacts. And, there's also the question here around the market impacts of climate risk. We're increasingly seeing cases of climate gentrification in which locations which are less prone to climate hazards are now, experiencing a surge in property values. And, on account of this, there is a cascade of displacement. So this is a really complex issue. We're also looking at municipalities which are implementing new development and infrastructure standards, which are, using forward-looking climate data. FEMA put out an update, risk rating 2.0, just last month, which is also an important step in this direction from the federal policy perspective. A key tenet here is supporting communities that are in harm's way, and this can both be accomplished through investment in green infrastructure, protective strategies for existing housing, and also looking at strategies for supporting communities if they do want to move. Like, we're increasingly seeing community-based organizations looking at what floodplain buyouts could look like, you know, on account of the harm and the loss and the stress and the, you know, the trauma of having to regularly experience climate events. And then finally, a key, you know, alongside protecting the community members that are already at risk, you know, we're looking at development strategies to reduce new development in locations which are vulnerable to climate impacts. So alongside those policy trends, you know, we are seeing an very significant increase in recognition of climate adaptation and climate risk among the private sector. You know, and you can look at climate risk as essentially the financial impacts of climate change, considering both the transition risks, which refers to the transition to a low carbon economy, that's the, you know, future regulations, future costs, and the physical risks, which is considering, you know, the actual physical effects of climate change, the likelihood of property damage, business interruption, et cetera. We're seeing the private sector increasingly turn to private data providers to ensure that they have a better sense of what climate hazards locations where they invest are likely to experience. And, you know, there is a real risk of an equity gap in which private sector developers are using more sophisticated data sources than their local government partners. So that is something which we are looking at, and, you know, are participating in the call for open data access and incorporation of projected climate impacts into future planning. So to share a few examples before we turn this over to a discussion and then a presentation by Kim, we are increasingly, you know, again, seeing cities which are designing for the different climate hazards. So that's extreme heat, drought, and flood risk. And we had some examples from El Paso here where they are looking at strategies for public spaces. We're also seeing land use strategies embedded into other types of planning documents. So, you know, a climate action plan, for example, you know, is not only looking at strategies to reduce emissions, also having a chapter on adaptation and looking at, you know, what the social impacts are on account of climate change. I highly recommend looking at the Oakland Equitable Climate Action Plan. This is one of the first I've seen where equity is, you know, the sort of framing issue for the entire report, as opposed to like a standalone chapter. There's also an excellent climate justice and adaptation plan from Providence, Rhode Island, which takes a similar approach. King County, Washington has another example of using a climate justice framework and considering housing and transportation issues as climate issues. So, you know, looking at what climate change will do to housing supply, housing prices, and what policy interventions can help to promote affordability. Interestingly, looking at on a state level, the Vermont Climate Action Plan also includes strategies for investment in housing, missing middle housing like ADUs. So, you know, we're seeing these land use topics, which, you know, haven't traditionally been considered climate interventions, in the mix with these larger strategies to encourage more compact, dense living patterns and reduce reliance on cars. So I actually have a few poll questions here. I think we've had some issues from the ERI side on using Zoom Annotate. So instead, I'm going to cycle through a couple of discussion questions and would welcome people to put their answers in the chat, just to warm this group up and to hear a bit about how you're considering these issues. So, you know, we're looking at how can smart growth support climate adaptation, which land use strategies are suitable for a climate action plan or for other types of initiatives. So I will make sure that I can see the chat as well. Would welcome people to go ahead and put which climate hazards are your biggest concern into the chat. And actually, Matt, I'm having a hard time seeing the chat. So do you want to read out anything or up here ADUs, accessory dwelling units, anything that you see?
as an explanatory, and yes, happy to help facilitate. If you want to stay in presentation mode, I can look in the chat. So if folks want to drop in what they're most concerned about, flooding and water quality hazards. Flooding is definitely something we hear of prime concern from a lot of our local government partners in Indiana. Probably the most salient risk. We've got rising sea levels for East Coast, extreme heat, another vote for extreme heat.
Yeah, all of them, I think, and these are interrelated challenges, so definitely relate to that. And we're increasingly looking at extreme heat at SGA, given that it is presents the biggest public health risk, especially for, folks who are elderly or who have, other reasons that they might be vulnerable, low income communities without air conditioning. So thank you for sharing a bit of your thoughts in the chat there. Next, would be interested to hear, which smart growth approaches resonate with you, whether if you'd like to put that in the chat, looking at building codes, delivering higher density in strategic sites, reducing new development in harm's way. Would be interested to hear, what resonates with you and, what is your local government already doing? So, and if anyone has an excellent example of, this type of policy, feel free to also drop the links in the chat. We would love to check out what you're doing and to learn from it and to kind of bring it into the mix as we're thinking about this nationally. So yeah, using data with climate projections for decision making. Erin, can you share what data sources that you're using? And I know that the ERI has rolled out a lot of data availability for the region. Okay, would anyone else like to share on this?
I'll note that we have a few partners around the state investing in energy efficiency, especially in low-income communities, as well as setting design incentives for standards rather than standards within development ordinances to encourage more sustainable building practices and with greater energy efficiency, lowering utility costs, that sort of thing.
Great. And I see Anna is reducing or eliminating new development in harm's way. If you're willing to share, I'd be interested to see, how your community is doing that. I think we see a lot of intention around that, but we also are seeing nationally some communities where there are plans to deliver new affordable housing in the floodplain. And this is, this is something that we are trying to address because, while there is an affordable housing need, it's, the problems are only going to become worse in the near future. Okay, reducing new development in harm's way, Southern Indiana, put in a new terrain highway. Cool, looking forward to learning more about that. I will share as well an example that we are currently doing a study on, which I'd be happy to send to Matt and others when it's complete, is a look at the new zoning code in Norfolk, Virginia, where this is one of the first, what we're calling climate informed zoning, where flood vulnerability is a key aspect of the rubric for determining future land use. And so we're both looking at this as a policy best practice and also doing a fiscal impact study, looking at whether there were property value impacts after the policy change occurred. So that's something which we're working on right now. So next, to complement the discussion around climate adaptation, would be interested to hear which sustainable design methods are being used, to the most success in your community. I think, you all have joined the webinar, so I anticipate you're all doing most of these. Embodied carbon is a newer one for some of our constituencies where, I think especially on the private sector side, we're seeing some developers, look at the entire life cycle of the materials in a new construction project. So that is a newer one, along with some of these the tried and true methods around walkability and energy efficient standards. Another strategy listed here that we've been following is using reflective materials to reduce urban heat island. I found it interesting to follow, there's a number of different materials, some of which actually have had negative impact on pedestrians when applied, on a streetscape. So, a lot of these technologies are so new. I think there are still use cases determining, where it's most appropriate to take advantage of them. And so then final question, would like to hear how the private sector in your community is reacting to climate risk. whether you are seeing the real estate development community in your towns or in your region considering climate impacts in their decision making. And this is, I think it's something where there is significantly increased awareness amongst the private sector community, even with, for example, the new climate risk disclosure requirements from the SEC, this is increasingly mainstream, but it is not necessarily translating always into the type of projects that people are seeing planned and put forward for permitting. So, great. Okay, and I'm sorry to hear, Mark, that you're not seeing any of these methods in place, but this, I'm glad to see you're at the webinar and happy to talk about the resources that we have, and I know ERI has significant resources too. So great, well with that, I am going to, last slide has my contact information, feel free to follow up. I'd be excited to hear about what you're working on and sharing the resources that we have available.
Thank you so much, Katharine. And with that, we'll turn it over to Kim Irwin with Health by Design.
Hi, everyone. So good to be with you here. Can you confirm you're seeing the title slide? Awesome. Okay. Great to see many familiar names and a few faces from pictures. So thanks for being with us. For those of you that I don't know, I'm Kim Irwin. I serve as the Executive Director of Health by Design. As Matt said in the introduction, we celebrated our 15th anniversary last year, and I've been involved that entire time and in the staff position for most of it. In 2019, we began managing the Indiana Public Health Association as well. And so I did just want to reference that in this context as well. I'll largely be talking about health by design work and that built environment piece here, but wanted to, again, reference IPHA and the work that we're doing there. I'm going to speak more about it. My talk today is pretty high level, I would say still. And from my perspective, I think much of what we're doing well in Indiana around climate mitigation and adaptation is in the transportation sector, even though I say that knowing how much more we have to do. But all that to say, one of the things that I'll speak more about, and I'd love to ask you to just be thinking about for follow-up conversation, is not just what we do, but how we do it, right? So I will often say that, by and large, with some exceptions, we know what to do. We have more technical expertise, more best practice reports, more guidance out there than frankly any of us can read. The challenge is implementing those things, identifying what it takes in our communities at the state level to make it happen. And so again, my remarks will be tailored toward that a bit, but I'd love to just have you be thinking as we go through kind of what you have seen work and what we need to be doing better from an organizing and advocacy standpoint to make some of this happen. So again, just touching briefly on IPHA and the work there. With Health by Design, we are working at the intersection of the built environment and public health specifically. We are increasingly doing some work beyond Indiana, but we do a lot of work specifically in Indianapolis and then truly throughout the state, and you'll hear more of that. And again, very much about ensuring that our neighborhoods, our public spaces, and our transportation infrastructure, our infrastructure broadly, promote healthy living, active living kind of thing. Wanted to just touch very briefly on the key smart growth principles related to our work, certainly not all of them, and a few things that we know are really important that aren't going to be touched on much here, but really again about that, how do we create communities that are that have at least elements of being compact and dense, that are walkable, that are bikeable, that are transit oriented, that are universally accessible, certainly from an Americans Disabilities Act perspective, but also equitable, open, and again, connected for people regardless of age, regardless of ability, regardless of income. That our streets themselves become places and have elements of, again, the elements that we know support healthy communities. And that, again, we're creating easy access for people to get where they need to go. Everyday destinations is the term we increasingly use, and can do that without having to rely on a car. Partnerships are key to what we do, and those partnerships must be cross-sectoral and interdisciplinary. I am sure that all of you are, confident that you're working as much as possible across those disciplines, but I don't think we can stress that enough, given again how critical these issues are and how multifactorial they are. Just high level again, elements of a healthy community. We know that the transportation and land use piece is critical. We know the role of economic development and investment, private development, as has been referenced, the connection to crime and violence, and that connection even to climate change and heat and things that we increasingly understand. The role of parks and rec and green space and how that land is protected and cultivated and again, made available as widely as possible. All of those things are critical. And I also wanted to just use the term, and again, most of you are probably familiar, it's being increasingly used in broad dialogue, but around social determinants of health. And this increasing recognition that how well we live and how long we live is much more about the conditions of our community than anything that happens in our doctor's office. And so thinking about that and thinking about how, again, we ensure healthy communities is fundamental to this. So if we want healthy people, we have to be creating the conditions for health. That means we want them to be able to choose healthy behaviors. And in order to choose healthy behaviors, they have to have healthy environments, and healthy environments come as a result of healthy policies and systems. Again, language that we're using increasingly, some of you may be familiar with, and I'll come back to, is this idea of moving upstream. And I've got a graphic that I'll share and can share in follow-up that illustrates that well. And then just again, want to touch on the equity piece, centering equity in all of this, in all of its forms, certainly racial equity and the legacy of racism in this country and the ways that that has manifested in community development and in public health. But also other forms of oppression that we know are impacting people's lives day in and day out. Here's the graphic that we have been using. It might be a bit hard to see. It's from the Bay Area Regional Health Inequities Initiative in the San Francisco Bay Area. Again, I'll drop the link in the chat in a few minutes, but this is really, again, about saying, we can talk about disease states, we can talk about lifespan and life expectancy downstream all we want, but in order to ultimately make those changes, kind of go to that root cause, we've got to be looking upstream at the structural and institutional factors, inequities that are influencing that. And so this work is based on not just the work of Health by Design and partners like Smart Growth America, but so many others over the years, the past many decades, and this recognition that we're really not making the level of progress that we need to be. And part of that is because we continue to invest the vast majority of, certainly of health and public health dollars, but arguably other human services, social services dollars as well, very downstream without the emphasis on changing those community conditions. So going back to my comment about kind of we know what to do, we like to use the DNA as an example, the double helix of DNA as to make the point that how we do things is as important as what we do. And so again, I'm going to touch on that a bit more, and then we'll want to have some discussion if possible. So in this element of, or in this line of shifting upstream, just wanted to offer a little bit more context as well around policy systems and environmental change. That may be a phrase that some of you are familiar with, but I think again, it's important for us to be thinking about what are the interventions, what are the countermeasures that lead to the type of change we want to be seeing at the community level. And so a very good example of that is a more programmatic or downstream approach would be hosting community bike rides or walking events, even things like Walk with a Doc that have grown in popularity over time. Whereas a more policy systems environmental change approach would be adopting a complete streets policy to ensure that, that the work of public agencies, departments of public works and others are ensuring that access, connectivity, safety, and some other examples there that you can reference well. Again, at a very high level, making the connection to nature is so important. We know the mental health benefits of that. We know the physical health benefits of that, but also thinking about it in the context of this discussion and around climate change, we need to be thinking about how we do that wisely and how we protect space, how we build spaces that offer flexibility that can not just help mitigate, but can accommodate when we do have flood events and such. That community engagement piece is critical. We know that many communities have been historically left out intentionally at times and unintentionally at others, but that engagement piece and making sure that we are not doing things to communities, right, but with them and helping to offer up the opportunity for them to identify and pursue solutions directly is a key piece. I think we can't underestimate this idea of placemaking and creating more places, both from the infrastructure side, but that sort of social connectedness side as well, and how that can enhance what we're trying to do, and again, also build in resiliency elements. Building places for people and trying to do that in various ways. We've got an image here out of Fort Wayne. And then again, this idea of community very broadly in terms of both community from an engagement standpoint, but community from a activation and organizing standpoint. So I'm just going to go very quickly through a few additional slides that are more tactical, if you will, this idea of health and planning and action. Many of you, or some of you, might be familiar with the active living workshops that we've done across the state over the past many years. We have some new ones happening. Actually, and the team is in, part of our team is in LaPorte today working on those, but really thinking about framing the transportation and land use, again, interventions, countermeasures, the things we want to see happen in terms of policies, in terms of plans, in terms of programs, projects, and then performance measures. And obviously under each of these categories, there are countless individual strategies that can be pursued, but we want to be thinking about those collectively and holistically, and then how they fit together. Again, policies that support having aspects of daily life, those everyday destinations close by and accessible. Many of you have probably heard of the 15-minute city or the walk zone idea, that kind of thing. How do we develop plans, policies, zoning measures to support that? Want to make sure that we've got not just sidewalks, but bikeways, multi-use trails, other types of infrastructure that are connected to mixed use buildings that support both retail and services, but also people living within that. And that make those spaces very easily accessible, and again, safe, comfortable for everyone. And again, streets where we're building and landscaping the right of way in ways that make it more inviting and comfortable, and again, engaging in terms of having people participate actively and be out and about. A few specific policy examples. Complete Streets is one of the best tools, and we have now about more than 30 policies across the state. If you haven't heard, Indianapolis is in the process of updating its Complete Streets ordinance right now. Public hearing next week, and we are at the 10-year anniversary of that Complete Streets policy. Lots of lessons learned, lots of things to incorporate as we move forward, but also a chance to celebrate the benefits that have come with that. Form-based code is a tool that's important, and South Bend, and we may have a South Bend representative with us, actually worked with Smart Growth America and developing their form-based code and implementing that in ways that is allowing the city to move forward, or the region to move forward in ways that will both, again, promote or support climate change and sustainability in that way, but also allow additional development and infill development and such things. Transit-oriented development, certainly an important tool, even in communities that don't necessarily have the level of transit service that we'd love for them to see eventually. The rendering on the right is actually from Valparaiso. Valparaiso is connected via transit to Chicago and and as part of the Northwest Indiana Regional Transit. But again, even thinking about how their downtown area and campus and such can be connected. This graphic on the right, or sorry, on the left is from the Thrive Indianapolis plan that incorporated transit-oriented development in that sustainability plan. And then just wanted to note an initiative in Gary where they're looking at transit service, and then the land use around that on their Broadway corridor, incorporating with their rapid service a number of elements of development, of housing, of services and retail to increase the mixed use of that area. Road diets are a tool many of you may be familiar with. We typically have very wide lanes and lots of room to convert roadways here in Indiana in many of our cities. And one thing that I haven't touched on, and apologies if I'm repeating myself, but that idea of green infrastructure and how we can incorporate green infrastructure into transportation projects and development projects as well, but to try to mitigate against some of those issues around flooding and extreme storm events that we know we are having more of and will continue to see. And then the last thing, knowing sort of the financial constraints that face many of our places and just what we're working with in terms of tax base and such, I definitely want to point out kind of the idea of traffic calming and traffic calming through tactical urbanism and other low-cost materials, pop-up projects. Many of you, again, may be familiar. If you're not, there's some great work going on around the state that has been funded through the State Department of Health. But really figuring out how to use low-cost materials, planters, bollards, paint, movable or even fixable benches and street furniture and such to narrow roadways as in this case, or to sort of test projects like a traffic calming circle that can be incorporated then longer term over time. And as I move toward closing, I just want to mention this concept of health in all policies. Perhaps familiar to some of you, certainly we'd love to see more traction around that throughout Indiana, but it really is a transformative, collaborative approach that ensures that in all areas of decision making typically for a public agency, you could incorporate it other places as well, we are looking at, how is this impacting health? How is this decision impacting equity? How is this decision impacting resilience? So whether it's a housing project or a criminal justice project or a, certainly transportation, maybe education, how are we thinking about from a internal system standpoint or an internal process standpoint, how are we thinking about the consequences of the decisions that are being made in any one project as it relates to the issue overall? And so happy to talk more about this with anyone that's interested, but just wanted to make sure to note it as kind of an overarching, again, approach to integrating many of these topics, which too often get siloed in our in the way we do business, but need to be connected. And so just a few final thoughts, again, more around this idea of how we get things done. So as we think about community resiliency, there's certainly a level of leadership that must be there. And that often, ideally maybe is elected leadership, but it's also civic leadership, it's resident leadership, it's youth leadership, figuring out how to advance these conversations and move toward, again, the types of things we want to be seeing. I'm going to say more about infrastructure and capacity, but no doubt we need more training, we need more education, we need more resources, we need more people involved in these things, both formally and informally. The idea of having flexible and sustainable funding can be used is an important piece. That political will element, critical, as I said, and then again, this idea of civic infrastructure, which for us is very much about building, again, kind of across the spectrum, not just elected leadership, not just traditional decision makers, but for all people, this idea of how do we shift social norms, right? How do we make it more common to walk to school? We've lost that over the past 6-7 decades. How do we get back to that? It's about strengthening organizational and community capacity, both again, formally within public agencies, but in our community partners, that multidisciplinary circle that I started with, or circle of partners that I started with. the idea of strengthening partnerships, making connections across that, opportunities like today and others to network and to develop that. Building the base of support for people who want to see policies, land use decisions, transportation decisions that support sustainability and resiliency is key. And then again, that idea of improving policies, systems, and environments in order to create the community conditions that support health. Second to last slide, intention. I talk often, if you've heard me talk, you've probably heard me talk about the inertia of the status quo. The easiest thing to keep doing is what we're already doing. And I would argue that that drives the vast majority of decisions that are made, not just in city government or state government, but personally, right? In my own life as well. And so there's a level of intention, a level of commitment, a level of persistence that is critical in order to advance, again, the change here. And so I just always like to make a point to note that these things do not happen naturally, unfortunately, rarely at least. And we really have to be intentional about creating this change that we want to see. Quick promo, I'll send more to Matt and Matt that can be sent out later, but we are having a Health Equity Summit in June, a virtual summit. So would love to see as many folks there as possible and hope you'll help promote that. And with that, I will close.
Thank you so much, Kim. Such a wide range of things, also important, and just highlights the deeply intersectional nature of all this work with health, equity, resilience, how mitigation adaptation policies sort of interplay and often create feedback loops, with one another. So with that, we can open it to questions from attendees. If there's thoughts that spurred about challenges you're facing in your own community, how to tackle certain types of issues in your planning or implementation, we'd love to hear about it and benefit from Katharine and Kim's expertise here. Feel free to share in the chat. And Sadie, I see your hand raised there. Amanda, if you're able to ask her to unmute, I think we can try that. Yeah, go ahead. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you. I'm just on my phone and it's so hard to type. I was so happy to hear you say building and designing with communities, not for them. And we're kind of working on that right now in my work. But I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about that. What does that mean, especially in contrast to the typical planning?
Yeah. Yep. And Sadie, can you say where you're located?
I moved back to Minnesota last year, and I am with the city of Rochester.
Oh, very cool. Very nice. So I could talk for an hour about this, so I'm going to try to be really succinct. So, I mean, I do think like fundamentally it's about telling people what we're thinking about and asking them for their input. And the telling part is literally like, here's something we want to ask you about, right? Like, I mean, so often we're not starting from scratch, right? We're starting with, we're trying to solve this problem. We want to use this approach. And again, I can go into some more specifics, but truly going to the people. And I think there's so many aspects of that. I think virtual has, the world we're in and virtually has made it easier in some ways and more complicated in others. The one thing I do want to say, and mostly because I think y'all are, smart people thinking about these things, and so I'm always interested. I used to be, I am a huge proponent of public engagement. It's critical. And I don't think people should have to ask for basic things, right? You should not have to ask for a sidewalk to get a sidewalk in your community. And so the other thing that I feel like happens sometimes in the community engagement piece is it almost gets twisted around like, well, they said they didn't want a sidewalk in their neighborhood, so we're not building one. Like, that's not okay, right? And so I just wanted to point that out as something that I think there sometimes becomes an expectation that the community has to know what to ask for in order to get it. And that's not okay either. So I think that staying very solution focused, and this is a little bit off the top of my head, but the way, like staying very solution focused, what are the problems we're trying to solve? how are the ways that we can go about solving that? And how can you all as community members, like, how do you want to do that? To me, it's very much about process as opposed to, again, like a specific topic or that kind of thing. So at the risk of belaboring it, I'm going to stop there, but welcome thoughts or an offline conversation. But the burden, to me, the burden is on us as people in the work to identify, go to, and engage the community. Katharine, anything you want to say on that?
Yeah, something I'll share, getting back to the type of work that we do nationally. SGA has always done a lot of technical assistance directly for local governments, and a key part of this is strategizing around community engagement. Right now, we're also increasingly doing work directly for community groups where, the residents are looking to advocate for zoning reform, for different infrastructure decision-making. And I mean, I agree with you. The onus should not be on the community groups to get out there and to testify on behalf of like the basic infrastructural investment needs and housing affordability needs. But unfortunately, that is the way the system works right now. And so we're trying to increasingly sort of support and co-power the community organizations to get out there. But as we look at systems change, like that really should not be necessary, especially for communities which are overburdened in other ways and for which it's a major ask often to, engage in a process which may not be compatible with, childcare or home responsibilities or job hours. So.
Great points. Thank you both. If there's others with questions, feel free to put them in the chat or raise your hand. We could do that as well.
Yeah.
See one from Grayson here. I'll go ahead and read. What would you say is the current level of understanding in planning circles regarding how citizens' pro-social actions are thought of in terms of their free will versus how that behavior is coaxed out in a more deterministic manner by designing cities so it is easier to be healthier and more engaged? Speaking to some of those feedback loops, I think I was thinking about myself in your presentations.
Interesting question.
Yeah.
It's, I guess what I'll maybe share a follow-up example that I was thinking of. Both of you talked about mixed use neighborhoods and everyday destinations being accessible and being able to walk or access in 10 or 15 minutes your basic needs. And I think that helps to creating spaces where that's possible and enabling that through code changes helps to build community, right? Helps to create social resilience and social infrastructure needed to drive meaningful civic engagement and get people bought into understanding and supporting the very thing that helped enable that in the first place, right? That's what I'm reading in Grayson's question there. I'm not sure if you all took that differently.
Grayson, that is one heck of a question. Like there's so much there, right? And I think me individually and our organization, public health in general, is sort of based in this idea that like we create conditions that promote health and safety, right? There was a book 15 years ago, maybe or less, Nudge. I love that book. Like it aligns exactly with how my approach to how I think about these things. And also that is directly at odds with at least a vocal, maybe not a majority, but a vocal group of sort of leadership and the public in the world we're living in now, right? And I don't have an answer for that other than that I think naming it is important. I love that you asked the question, and I think we have to keep, again, the burden is sort of on us, I think to some extent, to figure out how to talk about this, how to use examples, how to bring the stories forward that are acknowledging that and balancing that in the work we're doing. Again, I could say way more. Go ahead, Katharine.
Yeah, I'll add one additional thought here. I think there is a question too around, obviously, who is being engaged. And I think, especially when you're looking at the dynamic with the potential like NIMBY or YIMBY conversation, often there is a like degree of support in concept for mixed use development or additional affordable housing requirements, which there may be support in concept, which doesn't necessarily translate into support of a project which is within a short distance of someone's property. And so in that case, I think you often have a question around, well, who is being engaged here? Is the larger community being engaged, the individuals who will benefit from being able to live in this neighborhood, as well as the people who are already here? So that's kind of one additional thought there.
I have one from Sadie again in the chat. What sources have you looked to in order to develop your approach to both comprehensive or systemic planning, as well as individual project planning?
I think there's a lot out there right now, especially in the pandemic era. Like it's so, it's increasingly easy to tune into webinars, articles, everything else. I think a big priority for me looking at climate adaptation has been trying to better understand which communities are managing to successfully roll up more of these objectives within the type of planning that they're already doing. So addressing climate adaptation in comp planning, or doing a zoning rewrite with climate action goals. So that's something that interests me, because I think, I get the sense a lot of us on this call are planners. Everybody loves to plan, but when there's like 25 plans, it's not always, everything doesn't end up being prioritized for implementation.
My quick answer, which is not a source or sources, but I said it earlier, I think process matters most. And so to me, and there's lots of guidance around processes, but having a process in place that is designed to get the outcome you're seeking, and not the actual outcome, but the type of outcome, right, that you're seeking, and being very intentional about equity and other factors along the way, cognizant of potential unintended consequences of process, like to me, that matters. And so the one thing that specific example I'll just say is that we worked on the pedestrian plan in Indianapolis a couple of years ago, and the whole intent of that plan, and we were very successful, I'm very proud of it in doing it, is to put a methodology in place that was data-driven and that had clear parameters for how projects would be prioritized. Because there is so much of this work is about trade-offs, right? Political trade-offs, public engagement trade-offs, like trade-offs. And so if we're thinking about the process, then we can account for trade-offs a bit more than when we're just like plowing ahead. So a data-driven methodology to our pedestrian plan was critical. Now, implementation is a different conversation for a different day, but the process that we went through to develop that mattered. And to me, those are the types of things that are really important around these conversations.
I'll add a final note on an implementation, actually dovetailing off what Kim said, which is I think that sometimes I've seen successful plans build that into the approach. So I was looking at, for instance, Cambridge, Massachusetts, I think has had 2 versions of an ordinance now that says anytime you're updating street construction, you incorporate what's in our transportation plan for bicycle pedestrian infrastructure. You can't improve this street or repave it or maintain the status quo. It puts that on trial, and rather it says we've established a plan. This is where we're headed, this more sustainable approach, and it kind of builds that in as the default, which I think is a big challenge with implementation. We have to change the way we're making decisions and the metrics we use to analyze possible investments or decisions. And to the extent that we can include that in planning processes, I think that's helpful too, to overcome some of that. Maybe it's a nudge, like Kim said. It helps us overcome some of those barriers. So we'll be sure to send out some of these resources in a follow-up email along with the recording. It usually takes us about a week to get that processed and transcribed. But like I said, you can always find that on our website as well. Thank you so much again to Katharine Burgess with Smart Growth America and Kim Irwin with Health by Design for joining us today. Thank you, Amanda, for helping to facilitate. We really appreciate you joining, and perhaps we'll see you next month for our June webinar.